And yes, we are ready. The sound does work, as we've learned to check. All right, if we'll stand, we'll say our prayer. Find a spot, Paul. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. O heavenly King, comfort the Spirit of truth, Lord of our present, and fills all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life. Come and abide us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. Amen. Right, so tonight, make sure, yes, looks like it all works. I apologize. I don't have a big map. I have a bunch of little maps. And for those who are watching online, this is not going to help them. But I'll once the video is done tomorrow, I will post a link to where these maps come from. I don't think that'll help you, Michael. Because it is from a YouTube video where I took snapshots. So I'll post the link. So if you want to watch the movement of national borders, basically, from I think around the time of Christ or before, till 2017. And so, but what I have here is snapshots that will help us for the next coming lessons to have a sense of what the world looks like. Because tonight we are dealing with yes, it's not perfect, so you can laugh at me all you want. This is a lecture on a shoestring. So the time period that we're covering is we're focusing specifically on the area of what historically what the people called the Rus, who become a number of different countries today, but they all have a similar origin in Eastern Europe. And so, of course, the conversion of the Rus is at 988, which we've already talked about. So this will cover we'll just start with 988 and go to 1448, when you have the emergence then of an independent or an autocephalous church over the Rus that's based in Moscow as opposed to Kiev. So, but of course, this history is intertwined with the history of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, as well as Finland, the Swedes, and the rest of Europe and Asia, of course. So at times we'll be touching on all kinds of things. So the conversion of the Rus under Prince Vladimir of Kiev, of course, is the starting point in 988. At this time, the metropolitan is appointed, the bishop is appointed from Constantinople to be over Kiev. And this holds true for this whole period. Basically, that the senior bishop of the church in this area is appointed from Constantinople and would be consecrated in Constantinople and then come up north to the city where he would have his episcopal throne, which will change, even though the title will remain the Metropolitan of Kiev and all the Rus, and all Rus, or all Russia eventually. He won't reside in Kiev always, and we'll see why. Around the same time, you have a spelling mistake, and this says Kingdom of Poland instead of Kingdom of Poland. Sorry about that. Around the year 1025, you have the Kingdom of Poland, which is established. And on the map that you have, the first date is 1204, but you do see Poland there next to Rus principalities in the south, Novgorod Republic in the north, Baltic people, where Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are today, roughly, and part of what would be Prussia. But the Kingdom of Poland goes back till 1025. And this is before there is any schism. So we can speak of, in a sense, the Christians at that time all being in communion with one another between Poland and the Kingdom of Poland and the Rus. Around the year 1100, the Metropolitan of Kiev leads a synod of 9 bishops. So there are 9 dioceses, along with his own archdiocese, in a sense. So that's the size of the church at this point. By the year 1200, which our map shows us basically the picture of 1200, the Metropolitan of Kiev leads a synod of 12 bishops. So 3 more dioceses has been added to the church by this time. You also see in 1204, the Kingdom of Hungary, of course, is there in existence. Bohemia, the Holy Roman Empire is there. France is forming into what it will become, along with, in a sense, the English and the Scots are having their own trouble at this point in history. Norway and Sweden, and the start of what will become a Finnish kingdom is there. And if you look down, our map is at 1204. This is the Fourth Crusade. This is what the war looks like after the Fourth Crusade. So a Latin empire controlling Constantinople. You have Thessaly. You have the Duchy of Epirus, the Empire of Nicaea, the Empire of Trebizond. These are all, in a sense, fragmented parts of the Eastern Roman Empire that had been based out of Constantinople. And then all of the other kind of smaller principalities going east through what is modern-day Turkey. And this is what happens. Basically, the Fourth Crusade takes Constantinople and creates, in a sense, chaos, political chaos at this point in Eastern Europe, and destabilizes the region for centuries to come, at least in that part of the southeast Europe, on the edge of Asia. So, but we're focusing tonight on what's going on north of there, in what is the Rus principalities in the Novgorod Republic. It's interesting. Novgorod is the major city in the north, and what we will find is, as we go forward in time, Novgorod has a much more, I don't want to call it democratic, but they tend to desire to elect their own hierarchs, and they have a much more, I guess, republican, not in the terms of political party, but republic in terms of political structure of what a republic is. And in the north, and the Rus principalities are made up of multiple princes who govern their own principalities, and one is the Grand Prince. In the sense that there's the princes, and then there's the Grand Prince. And the Grand Prince of Kiev is kind of the senior prince at this time. And so it's not one unified kingdom. It's a bunch of kingdoms that are in confederation with each other. And that's kind of the structure of things. So the Metropolitan of Kiev is kind of a unifying figure over the Rus principalities, the Novgorod Republic, as well as parts of Poland and the Baltic people. And this will be the case going forward, because his jurisdiction will overlap with not just the Rus in terms of the principalities of Rus, but also then of Novgorod principalities and what will become Lithuania, as well as parts of Poland. Wherever the Orthodox are in those 3 separate kind of political structures, he's the bishop, kind of the head bishop over all of those. And so he's not just the bishop of one kingdom. Okay. In 1236, you have, the next map is for 1242, we're not there yet, but 1236, the Prince of Novgorod is a man named Alexei, or Alexander, and he becomes Saint Alexander Nevsky. Nevsky becomes his title because he wins a battle at the river Nevsky against the Swedes, my ancestors, some of my ancestors, who try, you see the Kingdom of Sweden there, which also controls part of Finland at this point in 1204 on the map. The Swedes are coming over into Novgorod to expand their territory by 1236 in that time period. And he successfully repels them along with the Teutonic Knights from the west. If you flip, I believe, to the next map for 1242, you will see the Teutonic state and the emergence of Lithuania, Polotsk, a kingdom called Polotsk, and you see a number of principalities: Galicia, Kiev, Chernigov, Peroslav, Smolensk, Vladimir, and the Novgorod Republic. These are all different principalities run by different princes. The Teutonic state is again the Teutonic Knights, which their formation goes back to the Crusades. And they are part of the Crusades, but the Crusades of northeastern Europe. The Bishop of Rome continues the crusading tradition, but no longer to the Middle East, but to the conversion or to the bringing in to submission to Rome of those who aren't in submission to Rome, specifically in different parts of Europe, North and Eastern Europe specifically, and this is what the Teutonic Knights are doing there. But St. Alexander Nevsky repels attacks from the Swedes and the Teutonic Knights. He is Grand Prince, he's Prince of Novgorod from 1236 to 1240, and then he is granted the title as well, being Grand Prince of Kiev, again, which is a different principality. And then in 1246, he becomes Grand Prince also of Vladimir. And you can see the kind of the different regions on the 1242 map of where those places are. He is, in a sense, the prince of all of those principalities. So he's also canonized a saint. At this time period, you also see the emergence of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is established. At first, you have to remember, Lithuania is the last European people to be Christianized. They remain pagan the longest. And so 1236 is the establishment of their, what they call the Grand Duchy, their kingdom. But it's pagan. It's a pagan kingdom. And it's only later, as we will go through this, that in a sense they will be Christianized from the east, from the Orthodox lands, as well as from the southwest, from Rome. And eventually it'll be Rome that they, in a sense, align with. So at the same time, you have the emergence in 1237. So I'm just going down the timeline that was passed out, of what's called the Golden Horde. Begins the subjugation of the Russian lands. And on the map of 1242, what you see is the furthest extent of in the Golden Horde. These are Mongolians. The descendants, the grandson of Genghis Khan, pushes into Europe all the way to the Adriatic, into what is modern-day Croatia, very fast. And you can see the timeline here. 1237, this begins. 1238, Vladimir is captured. Kiev is burned by the Mongols in 1240. And it no longer then is the residence of the Metropolitan of Kiev because the city is destroyed and has to be rebuilt. In 1241, the kingdoms of Hungary and Croatia are conquered by the Mongols. But in 1242, Khan Batu, grandson of Genghis Khan, pulls out of Europe, for the most part, and goes back to Asia. And basically Croatia and Hungary are spared, and parts of Eastern Europe that are closest to Central Europe, in a sense, are pulled outside of the Mongol yoke, or the Mongol control, what becomes referred to as the Golden Horde. The capital of the Khan in this area is the city of Sarai, or Sara, on the lower Volga River, and that capital is what's called the Golden Horde. That's the name of the capital. And so you see on the map the Mongol Empire and all the principalities that are a lighter shade. It's gray, but in the when you look at the screen, these are black and white. It's red, and then a lighter shade of red. So Galicia, Kiev, Chernigov, Preslav, Smolensk, and Vladimir, these are all, in a sense, in submission to the Mongol Empire. So Hungary, Bohemia, Serbia, Bulgaria are outside of the sphere of this Golden Horde in 1242, and it pulls back. But as you see, all of what is Russia, other than the Novgorod Republic and Polotsk, is under, in a sense, the lordship of the Khan of the Golden Horde. And this is a pressure then from the east upon the Rus that they have to deal with, and from the west, it is the Teutonic Knights as well as the other kingdoms that are in submission to Rome. So they will be being pressed between these two forces. The difference is how the church is dealt with. The Mongols' policy is basically to leave religious issues alone. They are interested in the economic benefit. And so they do not demand submission to any kind of religious beliefs. They themselves would be pagan. It's only later that this empire will become Muslim. At this point, it is not. And they actually they recognize the Metropolitan of Kiev as being a prestigious figure of having authority, and they exclude the church, clerics, the monasteries, the bishops, and the priests from taxation. And so the church is, in a sense, at this point, the most economically stable of any of the institutions in the Rus principalities, and because of their, in a sense, tax preference, whereas the princes are taxed heavily. And that's basically the extent of Mongol involvement, for the most part, is they want the money. And the princes are allowed to remain as long as they swear obedience to the Khan, and the Khan gets to choose who the princes are and so forth. But otherwise, that's the kind of the arrangement. Whereas from the West, the church would have to submit to the Bishop of Rome, and the church would have to alter its practices, its customs, to align itself with those in Rome. And so in some sense, the Mongols were easier to deal with than the Catholics at this point, which would continue when the Roman Empire based in Constantinople falls to the Ottomans. They follow the same line. They, in a sense, you don't have to convert, but you just have to pay. You have to pay heavy taxes. I would say they're a little more difficult to deal with, though. Initially, things are not as constrained as they will come in later years. But that's we'll touch on that in another later lecture. So in 1283, instead of a single metropolitan bishop in this area, there becomes a division. And let's see, I think the next map is 1262. You want to flip to that one. Instead of just being the Metropolitan of Kiev, who holds a synod over all of the dioceses in this area, now you have a Metropolitan of Kiev. You have at a time a Metropolitan of Halych, a Metropolitan of Lithuania at different times. And at this point in 1262, Lithuania is not that big. The Teutonic states are just as large. And so, but in years to come, the expanse of Lithuania and Poland will change over this area greatly. And so you have these different power centers of power, even if they're not Orthodox. The Lithuanians, in a sense, want an Orthodox metropolitan over the Orthodox in their territory. And then Kiev wants to retain its own metropolitan. But then you also have the great centers like Vladimir, who vie for a more senior bishop, Novgorod, and so forth. And at this time, again, all the Metropolitan of Kiev was always appointed from Constantinople. So you have this kind of upset in the structure of things from 1283 to 1378. And then we get to a number of the Metropolitans of Kiev that I want to talk about. The first being St. Peter Metropolitan of Kiev and all Russia, or all the Rus. In 1308, King Boleslaw, Yuri II of Galicia, and you see Galicia is the province, the principality right next to Hungary and Poland on the map. He nominated, and the Patriarch of Constantinople appointed Peter to the vacant see of Kiev and all Rus. The Grand Prince of Vladimir and Tyre and Tver wanted to advance his own candidate for this position. Peter's nomination caused prolonged animosity between Mikhail and Peter, to the point that the latter had to ask for protection from the Prince of Moscow. So Peter, the Metropolitan of Kiev, was not liked very much by the Grand Prince of Vladimir, and so Metropolitan Peter had to ask for protection from the Prince of Moscow. And this is where Moscow now starts to appear as a major player in terms of the structure of the principalities. This is in 1325. Peter traveled to Constantinople, where Patriarch Athanasius consecrated him as Metropolitan of the Rus and bestowed on him the hierarchical vestments and staff and so forth. Upon his return to Rus in 1308, Metropolitan Peter arrived in Kiev after a year and then proceeded on to Vladimir. During this time, the Tartars, the Mongols, authority over Rus was in turmoil, and Peter was often obliged to change the place of his residency. Peter transferred his see, his kind of throne, from the depopulated city of Kiev to Vladimir, the city of Vladimir, which is in the Vladimir region on your map. In 1325, Peter, at the request of the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan Kalita, transferred his throne from Vladimir to Moscow. The move strengthened the political position of Moscow and established it as the spiritual capital of the fragmented Rus. After Peter's move to Moscow, the Cathedral of the Dormition, which still stands in the Kremlin there to this day, and several other stone churches were built by the Grand Prince Ivan in the Moscow Kremlin. The foundation of the Visokopotrovsky Monastery in Moscow is also ascribed to this St. Peter. And I'm sure I butchered the name of the monastery, so forgive me. He also authored a few sermons and epistles, which we still have, and he died 21st of December, 1326. He was canonized then by Metropolitan Alexius, and his veneration was propagated all over the greater area that Moscow oversaw. So then it's in the mid 1320s that we have the move of the throne from Kiev to Vladimir, and then from Vladimir to Moscow. And now you can this is when the structure of the church in Russia, as we think of it today, begins to take shape. His successor, Saint Theognostus, Metropolitan of Kiev and all Russia, notice they don't change the name, his title. Even though he's in Moscow, he will still be the Metropolitan of Kiev and all the Rus, who resides in Moscow. Now, this is not unusual. Our own Patriarch John X of Antioch resides in Damascus and has for hundreds of years. He doesn't reside in Antioch. He has a cathedral in Antioch, but he resides in Damascus. So there's, this is not unheard of. So again, Orthodoxy, it's not a very organized religion. If you don't want, so if you're not interested in organized religion, this is it. Things are messy here. All this historical stuff and precedent and tradition and doesn't make for clean lines and things easily understood sometimes. So Theognostus was born in Constantinople, and later in his life became the Metropolitan of Kiev and successor to Peter. He chose Moscow as his primary seat, so he could have switched it himself, but he chose to keep it in Moscow. It was his lot to reconcile Novgorod and the Grand Duchy of Moscow in times of their mutual animosity. And this is often what the metropolits, the bishops, are doing. They're helping the princes to not kill each other, to resolve their conflicts at this point in time. They play this role of mediating between the Khan, between the princes, between the King of Poland, between the prince, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, and so forth. Theognostus managed to save all of the Russian church's valuables and gave up all of his own personal property after he had refused to collect tribute from the churches for the Golden Horde. So there was a policy change. The Khan said the church has to give money. Theognostus gave all of his money instead and refused to collect money from the churches. He was tortured by the Tartars for such audacity. It was the Khan who finally gave up, though, and confirmed the existing privileges of the church. After a fire swept through Moscow, Theognostus started to restore the churches that were there. In 1353, feeling that his days were numbered, Theognostus recommended Alexius, Bishop of Vladimir, to be his successor. Theognostus was buried in the Cathedral of the Dormition in Moscow, and he was canonized by the church in the 19th century. And this brings us up then, let's see. You turn the page, the map is for 1360. Sorry, press escape to exit full screen is kind of covering the date. I didn't wait long enough for that to disappear before I copied it. Sorry, this is an amateur hour. So, it's in this time period now, as you notice, Lithuania is much larger. It's almost as large as the Holy Roman Empire. It will overtake the size of the Holy Roman Empire and be the largest kingdom in Europe for a good long while. Especially seeing that it and Poland basically have this kind of dual relationship with each other. That um, Poland and Lithuania they're not the same thing, but they're in a sense united. It's like they're married in some sense, I guess would be a good analogy. They retained separate kingdoms for a good long while. Actually, at one point in the 16th century, it will become the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But up until that point, Poland and Lithuania basically are kind of like sibling kingdoms, basically, at this point. And so if you take them together, they rival the Holy Roman Empire at this time, that being the Holy Roman Empire, as we say, neither holy nor Roman, in Germany. So it's at this point that we have the emergence of the great Saint Sergius of Radonezh. And I'll read to you about his life from the prologue of Ohrid. Sergius was a great ascetic and light of the Russian Church. He was born in 1313 AD in the city of Rostov, of devout parents Cyril and Maria. At his parents' death, Bartholomew, which was his given name, became a monk, and he founded the monastery of the Holy Trinity in the forests of Radonezh. Radonezh is an area northeast, I believe, of Moscow. At this point, it's out in the boonies. Like, you can get to it from Moscow, but it's a good hike. It's not like you're going to take a day trip to get there. So, and what goes on here will become a pattern in Russia, in the Rus, territory of the Rus, in terms of how civilization expands. As a quiet and gentle servant of God, he knew only labor and prayer. Because of the purity of his heart, he was made worthy of the gift of miracle working, even resurrecting the dead in the name of Christ. The Holy Mother of God, the Theotokos, appeared to him many times. Princes and bishops came to him for advice. He blessed Prince Dmitry Donskoy, who was the Grand Prince or the Grand Duke of Moscow, and foretold his victory in the battle for liberation of the Rus from the Tartars. He saw into the hearts of men as well as future events. His monastery was full of monks, even during his lifetime, and century after century has been one of the most important centers of spiritual life of God's miracles. St. Sergius entered into rest in the year 1392. Following his repose, he appeared many times to various people. So we have, in a sense, the first monastic establishment in this area, of course, is the Kiev Caves Monastery, which we've talked about already in the previous lecture. If there's a second center of monasticism, it's Holy Trinity St. Sergius is how it's referred to now. Holy Trinity St. Sergius Lavra. In the modern age, the Kiev Caves is the main monastic, the main monastery for Ukraine, and St. Sergius, or Holy Trinity St. Sergius, is the main, in a sense, the mother monastic community for Russia. But at this time, those distinctions aren't it's not the same distinctions as we have today necessarily. So, but what happened is the monks wanted to get away from the people so that they could pray and they could hide their holiness. And so they would go out as hermits and found a small hermitage, small monastic community or dwelling, like a single house at first, with a few monks. And then people would find out about it. And this would kind of be out in the boonies. You know, most travel here, we're talking about travel by foot. So a distance by foot to get away. Now, for us by car, that's not going to be very far if we go by car, but on foot, it would be far enough that it's a hike. They can still get back to civilization for supplies or certain things, but it's far enough away that they're not going to they're going to be kind of hid until they get found out. And then what would happen, more monks, more men, more women would come to join the monastery. The monastery would grow, and then it would become the center. The fame of the monastery would draw lay people to it to settle around it and then it would become the center of a city, basically. And then the monks would get tired of the hustle and bustle of the communal life of the monastery, and a group of them would leave and go out again, far enough away to get away from the crowds, and build a little house in the woods, and the process would start all over again. Between 1350 and 1450, 150 monasteries were established in the northern part of what is Russia by this process, basically. In a sense, the land of Russia at this point is being expanded, right, by monastic centers. Questions? I'll pause. So if you, we'll hold off on that. Keep the map on 1360. It's then around 1390 that we have the next kind of key question.
How long would that process take?
I don't know. Years. The lifetime of a monk. He'd go off and hide. He'd repent. He'd draw close to God. That would draw other people to him. And by the end of his life, there'd be a big monastery around him. And then the next generation would be like, let's get out of here. It's too many, it's too crowded. Those who desired the kind of cenobitic life, the hermetic life. And, not all the monks wanted that. Some of them wanted to just be in a cenobitic monastery, a communal monastery, and they were fine. But others needed to kind of have seclusion. And so those who wanted seclusion, they would pop out. And that's how the next community would start. The same process happens still today. But the fact that a city would emerge around it, right, is a very kind of, this is distinct of this this period in what becomes Russia. Paul?
I wonder, why didn't they establish a monastery? But the houses would be away from each other, far enough away that they would make a giant people, and then they'll just spread out the houses so people would just go away.
It was impractical to build so many houses in the northern latitudes where you need to heat them. And building one house for just a few people instead of each person has their own house, it's a lot of effort. So, sorry.
Did they have women monasteries at this time?
Yes.
1,000 years ago?
Convents, yeah, of course. They're just as old as men's monasteries.
Yeah.
Women's convents are just as old as men's monasteries. They're not always as populated in terms of numbers, but they're just as, in a sense, they're where you have men's monasticism, you have women's monasticism. They're not always in the most inhospitable spots as some of the men's monasteries go, right? But and you don't have women nuns who are you don't have as many that follow the kind of the hermetic life to be hermits, but you do have hermitesses. Yeah. So what? Yeah. So Paul.
Why hasn't St. Archangel's Seat become a giant monastery?
Because it's only like 10 years old. It takes time. And maybe that, we'll see.
I thought that was a lot longer.
No, I think it's about a decade. So it takes time for monasteries to grow. Gotta get monks and nuns. So Metropolitan Cyprian of Kiev, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Algirdus, attacked Moscow, or the territory of Muscovy, on 3 different occasions between 1368 and 1372 as part of the Lithuanian-Muscovite War. At this point, Lithuania still is not completely Christianized. This was in support of his ally, Mikhail II, Prince of Tver. It may also have been motivated by a desire to advance his calls for a separate metropolis for the Grand Duchy of Lithuania that was independent of Moscow. Cyprian was sent by the Patriarch of Constantinople as an envoy to the Rus, to the princes in Lithuania and Moscow lands, or Muscovite lands, with the goal to reconcile the Lithuanians and the Tavirite princes with Metropolitan Alexius of Kiev and all the Rus, and to prevent the total division of the church between Vilnius and Moscow, Vilnius being the capital of Lithuania, which is still the capital of Lithuania to this day, a city which I visited when I was in college, actually. It was a place where I went and entered my first Orthodox church, actually was in Lithuania. So, in winter of the same year, it is possible that Cyprian went to Kiev for the first time, along with other cities of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And if you look at the map on 1360, you see Lithuania has taken up a bunch of territory in what is Eastern Europe. It's a lot larger, and it stretches into modern day Ukraine, as well as Belarus, and parts of Poland. So Cyprian returned to Constantinople from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, carrying a letter from the Orthodox Christians in the Lithuanian area. Because again, Lithuanians were centered around Vilnius in what is modern-day Lithuania, but they controlled a large area that was full of Orthodox Christians, even though they were pagan, or pagan and Christian at this time. And they were requesting the Patriarch to consecrate Cyprian as Metropolitan of Lithuania. So the hostilities between Moscow and Lithuania resumed. In August of 1375, Muscovite troops captured Tver. Patriarch Philotheos I of Constantinople was aware of the threat of the Catholicization of the population of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So at this point, the Catholics are trying to get the Lithuanians to convert to Catholicism. He therefore agreed to satisfy the petition of the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Algirdas, and he created a separate metropolis in the territory of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So instead of there just being, again, Kiev, there's now also a metropolitan of the Lithuanian Grand Duchy. Philotheos also listened to the petitions of the Eastern Orthodox princes to have Cyprian as their metropolitan. In December of 1375, at a council of Constantinople, Philotheos consecrated Cyprian as metropolitan of Kiev, Rus, and Lithuania, under the condition that upon the death of Alexis, metropolitan of Kiev, Cyprian should become his replacement. So he creates another metropolitan when the metropolitan of Kiev is there, but with the plan that once Alexis dies, Cyprian will also take his title and his authority. On June of 1376, Cyprian arrives at his residence in Kiev. He attempted but failed to get recognition of his rights in the metropolitan diocese from the Grand Duke of Moscow, Dmitry Donskoy. In fear of his life, both from the Grand Duke as well as the approaching armies of the Tomish, Cyprian chose to live either in Lithuania or at Constantinople. In 1378, Alexis died. By the terms of the agreement with the Patriarch, Cyprian was entitled to rule the religious affairs of all Rus. Instead, the Grand Prince deposed him, the Grand Prince, the permission of the Patriarch of Constantinople. And he next appointed Dionysius, again without permission of Constantinople. And then in February of 1389, Patriarch Anthony IV of Constantinople conveyed a council that restored the unity of the metropolis by finally recognizing Cyprian as the true bishop of all the Rus. In 1390, Cyprian returned to Moscow and was recognized. as the legitimate Metropolitan of Kiev and all the Rus by the new Grand Prince Basil II, or Vasily II, as they say in Russia. Cyprian held this title until his death in 1406, and it's under him that the disparate metropolitans now are back. There's only now one. Instead of multiple ones for different regions, now he is the metropolitan of the same historic territory that the Metropolitan of Kiev had governed. During his term, his main objectives were to preserve a unified metropolis in the Rus and to secure peace with Lithuania. And he's pretty successful at this. And this brings us to the conversion then of Lithuania. So by the 14th century, the 1300s, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania had emerged as a successor to Kiev Rus in the western part of its dominions. Although its sovereign was pagan, the majority of the population was Slavic and Orthodox. To legitimize their rule in these areas, the Lithuanian royalty frequently married into the Orthodox royal families of the Russian principalities. As a result, some Lithuanian rulers were baptized into the Orthodox Church as children or as adults. Peasants, though, largely remained pagan. The first one of the royal families of Lithuania to convert was Vasiliga, son and heir of Mindaugas, who took monastic vows at an Orthodox monastery. The final attempt to Christianize Lithuania was made by Jagilo, whose mother was Russian. Our author, Papadakis, who I've quoted from his book a number of times in past lectures, he notes that Jagilo had already become a Christian through Orthodox baptism. But he had the Teutonic Order opposing him from the West. And Jagiełło chose, therefore, to accept a Polish proposal to become Catholic by marrying Queen Jadwiga of Poland. So by marriage, he becomes King of Poland. And on these terms, in August of 1385, he is baptized a second time and becomes Catholic, signing the Act of Kreva. And this is takes place in Krakow, at the cathedral in Krakow. His cousin and vassal, Witold, Grand Prince of Lithuania, who also had been Orthodox, becomes Catholic because he's the vassal of Jagiełło. And this is then how Lithuania and then Poland solidify their unity with Rome going forward in 1386. And this will mark the history of the area, because when you flip the page over on the maps, you will notice in 1431, Lithuania is the largest kingdom in Europe, and it dwarfs Poland. It is 1.5 times, it's at least 1.5 times the size of the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, the Golden Horde is still present. And so the princes of Muscovy, of Moscow, you see there's a territory of Muscovy along with the Novgorod Republic. In a sense, this is the area of what will then, from there, in a sense, the Muscovites will slowly expand out to create what becomes modern-day Russia. But because Lithuania and Poland align Catholic, the area where the Orthodox and then the Catholics meet, right, becomes this border of tension historically. The Lithuanians come over into Orthodox territory, the Russians come back, and the area where they keep going back and forth over historically, that's Western Ukraine. And that's one of the most religiously diverse areas in that part of the world. And it's also one of the places with people who have the most vehement bitterness towards one another historically, because of these movements back and forth, because often force would be used to bring you into communion with Rome or be brought back to Orthodoxy. And some of that explains the tension in Ukraine right now that goes back hundreds of years to these events. And in a sense, force being used on all sides, unfortunately. So, in 1395, in the time of St. Cyprian, Metropolitan Cyprian, he has a very famous icon, which is called Our Lady of Vladimir, taken from the city of Vladimir to Moscow. And it's in this year, 1395, that Tamerlane, the head of the Mongols, surrounds or approaches Moscow to take it. But the icon of Our Lady of Vladimir is taken in procession and prayed before, and Tamerlane abruptly leaves. And it's seen as the city was saved by the icon, by Our Lady, through the icon of Our Lady of Vladimir. And many of you know this icon because it's right here. This is the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God, so which very famous, and I believe it still is in Moscow. It might have been taken back to Vladimir, I don't know, but it's still in Russia. And then in 1408 to 1431, we have Saint Photius, Metropolitan of Kiev and all Russia. He is made metropolitan by Patriarch Matthew I of Constantinople. He was given the right to rule the whole metropolis, excluding the metropolis of Halich. He arrives in Kiev in 1409, and by Easter he is in Moscow. The northeastern Rus, including the metropolitan region, was devastated by the invasion of Khan Edigu in 1408, resulting in famine and pestilence. Photius found his metropolitan residence ravaged and that the ecclesiastic treasury was empty. Photius made efforts to restore the church economy and the finances of the metropolis during the Grand Duke of Moscow, Vasily I, turning to the Grand Duke of Moscow, Vasily I, for help. The Metropolitan was concerned about the state of church discipline and morality. In 1414, the Grand Duke of Lithuania attempted to reestablish the metropolis of Lithuania. He arranged a synod of bishops to elect Gregory Samblak as the Metropolitan of Lithuania. The consecration took place without the consent of the Patriarch of Constantinople, Euthemius II, who deposed and anathematized Gregory, and who confirmed the same in letters to Photius. Emperor Emmanuel II, Palaiologos, and Grand Prince Vasily, after Gregory's death in the winter of 1419 to 1420, Photius made peace with the Grand Duke of Lithuania. As a result, the entire metropolis, including Halich, was unified under Photius until his death in 1431. And again, all the metropolitans I'm mentioning are included as saints in the calendar of the church. They're all saintly metropolitans. They all were largely Greeks, actually, who came up, who were sent up. It's in the time of St. Photius that St. Andrew Rublev paints his famous icon, the Hospitality of Abraham, of which we have a copy of it over there in the window with the picture of the three angels. So this is the time of Saint Andrei Rublev. The practice that had occurred at this time would be often that you would rotate a Greek and a Russian as metropolitan of Kiev. And this continued to be the practice, except when there was, in a sense, like emergencies or upheaval. But they were always appointed from Constantinople. So the princes would, in a sense, put forward candidates, and the patriarch and the emperor would choose. By and large, you had good relations between the princes of the Rus and Constantinople, and the emperor in Constantinople. The understanding was the Orthodox world was a commonwealth. The emperor kind of was the figurehead of that commonwealth, even though he did not have direct control over those principalities, especially the ones under the Golden Horde, but they still saw themselves as a part of this greater kind of commonwealth from the Roman emperor in Constantinople. And this holds true all this time period until we get to 1439. This is the year of the Council of Florence, where the efforts of the Roman Catholic Church are made to bring the Orthodox Church into submission to Rome. The context of the events, if you look on your map for 1431, and you look down at where Constantinople would be, you'll see in very tiny words, Byzantine Empire. You can barely make out the color difference. Wedged between two large land masses that say Ottoman Empire is this tiny little strip of land, including Constantinople. That's all that's really left of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, which modern scholars call the Byzantine Empire. Again, they never called themselves Byzantine. That's a modern invention. They called themselves Roman. But that's what's left of it. And so this is 1431 on your map. By 1439, the emperor of Constantinople is desperate to save his little tiny kingdom from the Ottomans. And for the sake of the political territory or the empire, the emperor puts pressure on the bishops of Constantinople and of the church there to come under submission of Rome so that Rome would send military aid. And that's what happens at the Council of Florence. Metropolitan Isidore of Kiev, who had been again appointed from Constantinople a few years before, is at the Council of Florence. And he agrees. He signs on, like a lot of the Orthodox bishops do. Largely out of pressure, most of them. And when the council ends or they leave, many of them reject their signature, stating it was under coercion or pressure. Isidore does not. He returns to Russia or to the principalities, to Moscow, to Kiev and so forth, traveling back north as a cardinal and as papal legate. And as he goes, he proclaims the union in all the territories. So at this time, Lithuania, right, the kingdom of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the royalty are Catholic. So it's easy for him to proclaim this throughout the territory of Lithuania because the royalty are all for it. But once he gets to Moscow, this is now outside of the territory of Lithuania, he celebrates the Divine Liturgy, commemorates the Pope, declares the union. And after a time, not immediately, I don't know exactly the timeline, but he gets to Moscow in 1441. That's how long it takes him to get up there. By 1443, he's in Italy again, because he had been arrested and they allowed him to escape, to leave. He was arrested in Moscow and he was allowed to escape, and he was arrested in Tver and allowed to escape, and he got to Italy by 1443. And the Grand Prince of Moscow sends letters to Constantinople, basically saying, "What's going on here? What happened? Who's the patriarch? We don't even know who the patriarch of Constantinople is right now. We need a metropolitan." Our metropolitan went nuts and went into schism, basically, and kind of playing dumb in some ways, not really trying to show all his cards, but writes to the emperor and to the patriarch in Constantinople, and he gets no response. So that was 1442, 41 when they write. They wait. And then in 1448, they elect a new metropolitan on their own without Constantinople, because they haven't heard from them. And they elect Jonas, metropolitan of Kiev and all the Rus, by decision of the local synod without approval of Constantinople. And so this is the first metropolitan, in a sense, chosen by the people locally. And this marks for the Russians their autonomy or autocephaly for them. Constantinople will not recognize this right away, but eventually they will. But even when they do it, it's not like a complete, done deal. If things were different, if Constantinople had gotten back to them, they probably would have gone back to the old system, because they were loath to kind of cause any division. But 1453 is when Constantinople falls. So there is no one to talk to anymore. There is no emperor. He's gone. The patriarch is now under the Turks and has no, in a sense, the weight of his authority is lessened by, in a sense, the temporal circumstances. And so this becomes the norm now after the fact, even though it wasn't necessarily the norm, the intention when it was done. So 1480 and 1480, Mongol rule over over Russian lands ends. So in that same century, kind of independence for the church emerges, and an independence from the Tartar yoke, what we call the Tartar yoke of the Mongol rule over those areas. And if you flip, you see the map in 1502, and you see the emergence of on the map, it's called Muscovy, what becomes the Russian Empire, starting to eat into Lithuanian territory. And there is no Mongol Empire. It's the Crimean Khanate, which is kind of the successors to the Mongol Empire, but they have no control over Muscovy anymore, or any of those territories, and they will disappear, in the next century or so, or their territory will shrink greatly as in a sense Moscow pushes out. So, questions?
We don't know why Constantinople didn't respond back.
Well, they were in chaos, because when the bishops came back to Constantinople, most of them repudiated their signature. They said it was we were made to do it. We don't believe in this union at all. And the people were all upset. The faithful and the monastics and the clergy, they were like, how can we be forced to come under submission to Rome? It was always a one-way deal. All of the discussions, it wasn't a discussion. It was, you accept this, or we don't help you. You accept that we have full authority. Rome has the full authority over everyone. No discussion, no questions asked. That was always kind of the terms. And that for the Orthodox, that just was unthinkable. Doesn't make any sense. It's not the tradition. That's not how the church functions. And so that always sabotaged any kind of effort on a temporal sense for the kingdoms in the east to get help from the west against Islamic invasion or Mongol invasion, because they were unwilling to, unless they were super desperate, in a sense, come under the authority of Rome. So that's why I said at the beginning, Russia, or what becomes Russia, is squeezed from two sides at this point for these few hundred years that we're looking at, from the Catholic armies on one side and the Mongols on the other, which the Mongol armies will become the Islamic armies. So, in a sense, that those forces were at play, and so that translates down into Constantinople as well. But that was not the kind of the focus of the lecture tonight. So just the Northern Europe area there. Any other questions before we end? What I want to say, we as modern people living in the West, I would imagine, are very tempted to be rather judgmental of the relations of the church and the state because of our own history of a rejection of the intimate relationship between the church and the state, because we only can think of it in negative terms of the state oppressing the church and monkeying with the church. But that's, in a sense, only the negative side of the relationship, right? There is the positive side, which for the most history from Constantine forward, it was the positive side of the church was the defender of the faith, right? You didn't have princes trying to dictate to the church about moral questions for the most part. Maybe every now and then some prince wanted to get married 3 or 4 or 5 times. And that would cause some, you had this emperors or princes, right? Because fourth marriages are forbidden in the church, right? But that would be the only kind of moral problem, right? Because of succession or heirs. But even in the East, the same kind of ideas about succession don't exist as they do in like England. And so the stability of the country isn't as troubled by bad successions from one emperor to another as it has been in the West. So you don't have, in a sense, the princes trying to alter the moral or ethical teaching of the church in any way. The thing that the princes might monkey with is because of territorial issues, jurisdictions of dioceses, and these kind of things, based on the changing temporal conditions of who governs what part of land. At this time in history, there are no democracies. There are, you have the Novgorod Republic, who's led by a prince still, right? But you have princes. Everyone has a prince or a king or an emperor or a grand duke, whatever the titles are. There's this, they all have the equivalence of power in a sense of, you have the executive power in a monarch, a hierarch, or a person of nobility, and then you have the other lesser nobilities assisting, the king or the duke or whoever it is, the emperor, in governing the territory, and they have say in, at times of who might become the bishop and so forth. But they have in the East, they would never have say at this point in time in theology or what is moral. The place of the church was to make sure the faith of the prince was correct. And then the prince was supposed to implement that to make to create a kingdom that was just and moral and right. And that's how it functioned. That will change, as we know in Western European history and so forth, especially with the Protestant Reformation, right? But we're not there yet. So that's not the context that we're dealing with right now. And so we have to kind of remember the way people conceived of things and thought about things the idea of kind of democracy being this kind of elevated form of government, this is not how people think at this time. At times, democracy is kind of ridiculed because it can lead to tyranny of a majority over a minority just by democratic vote. In a sense, it can move, it can shift, it can change much more rapidly, depending on the whims of the people, than a monarchy. Because the monarchy, in a sense, the church is there to point out to the monarchy what is right and true. And the monarchy recognizes that's the church's function. And that they have to, in a sense, they have to listen. Now, the relationship between the church and the state differs in the East than it does in the West. In the West, the Pope becomes also a temporal authority. And that is not just a temporal authority, but the temporal authority over all temporal authorities. And that combining of spiritual and temporal authority into one person is the ground from which all the problems will then arise within the power structures in Europe. And we'll get there when we get the Protestant Reformation. But that's not what's going on in the East at this time. So, all right. Next week is Thanksgiving. We will not have class. We will have a break, and we'll come back on the Feast of St. Andrew. We will have Vespers and our potluck and our next class. And we'll be talking about Christianity in the country of Georgia, Armenia, Ethiopia, and Egypt. All those places that most of us forget about having been Christian, on the edges of the Roman world. So we'll talk about those. God bless you.